Hello and welcome to an A-level history revision tutorial. Today we're going to look at Tudor rebellions and we'll focus on some common themes in rebellions and chart the change and continuity of causes across the period. So the aims of our session are to survey rebellions across the early Tudor monarchs' reigns, and in doing so we'll compare changes in the causes and motives of the rebellions across the period, and we'll also build our contextual knowledge of some key policies that sparked rebellion in these reigns. So we can identify some common causes of rebellions that come up repeatedly across the period. We're going to see some rebellions caused by dynastic change, where the rebels are attempting to change the regime. We'll see some that are sparked by court politics, where a particular faction is forwarding their interests, but falling short of trying to change the monarch. As the period continues in its second half, we'll see those that are inspired by religion and have a religious agenda. And all the time in the background, we're going to see the economic distress of the lower orders fueling these rebellions too. We should be aware that the first three are often linked. As the Tudor period continues, you really can't separate politics from religion, for example. So we'll see all three often combining in various degrees at the same time. Here's a timeline of our early Tudor monarchs, and we'll complete this with rebellions and work our way through from 1485 to 1558. So let's start with Henry VII, and we're going to look at three rebellions in his reign. So here are some of the key features of Henry VII's reign. He'd won the crown by force on the battlefield, effectively bringing the Wars of the Roses to an end. But this had left the crown impoverished and weakened. The nobles were overmighty. They were not used to a high degree of central control from the monarchy. Their tax collecting and tax returns were poor. They held illegal retinues and had built illegal fortifications. And this leaves Henry in a weak position in his first years. Now he set about strengthening royal control, but all the way through his reign he feels insecure. This is particularly prevalent in his later years, when he felt isolated and weakened, and this is reflected in his approach to government in his final years, which became increasingly avaricious as he attempted to bolster his security by finances. So across his reign, Henry VII focused on recovering and building the crown's power and control. So let's look at our first rebellion, just months into the reign, by Viscount Lovell and the Stafford brothers, who aimed to reinstate the Yorkist kings. Lovell had been Richard III's chamberlain, the head of his household, and the two Stafford brothers were noble brothers of middling rank. Now all three had claimed sanctuary at Colchester after the Battle of Bosworth. This meant that they were protected by the church. And there they plotted and hatched a plan where Lovell would head north to raise forces and the Staffords would head west to Worcester. And once they'd raised forces, they would combine and then face Henry militarily. Now Henry caught wind of this. He was actually on progress in the provinces at the time, and he promptly dispatched forces to confront the Staffords. When Lovell heard of this, he fled the country. So he fled to Burgundy, where he was given refuge by Margaret of Burgundy, Richard III's sister. Now that's not the end for him. He actually returned a few years later and took part in the Battle of Stoke, where there was an attempt to place the pretender Lambert Simnel on the throne. And this gives us our first indication of the importance of the Burgundian court and the nuisance that Margaret was to Henry VII. The Staffords also claimed sanctuary again, But Henry broke the sanctuary and his forces arrested the Staffords, and the elder brother, Humphrey, was executed. This was a controversial move. Royal forces weren't allowed to seize people from sanctuary, but this gives us an indication of Henry acting dynamically and forcefully in the early years of his reign. So the significance of this rebellion is that it shows us that pro-Yorkist elements remained even after Bosworth. There is a physical and actual threat to Henry's reign that he has to deal with. This is our first indication of Burgundy and Margaret of Burgundy as a base for potential opposition, and it's an example of Henry VII being decisive when required to be. Now our next two rebellions are going to be tax rebellions. It's worth us just accounting for the geography here. So we're going to first look at the Yorkshire rebellion in 1489, and then we're going to look at the Cornish rebellion in 1497. Note that they're opposite ends of the country, far away from London, and also far away from Scotland and Normandy respectively. So let's look at the events of the Yorkshire Revolt. This was a revolt to try to prevent the imposition of a new tax. The concerns are mainly financial. So it's mainly the commoners, the lower orders, who are most affected by this. And they take the lead in this rebellion. This is a lower orders phenomenon on the whole. They're led by an illegitimate member of the Percy family, who were the regional power, the historic regional power in the north. And it's Sir John Egremont, an illegitimate member of that family, who takes leadership. So here's what happens. Now Henry VII, all through his reign, attempts to avoid military action because it's so expensive and it created instability at home. However, he had decided to intervene on the continent to try to prevent the French annexation of Normandy. This would take money, and so he attempted to raise a tax for this. The people of Yorkshire felt distant from events on the continent. They couldn't see the relevance. They had more regional, more local concerns. And so the regional Earl of Northumberland, who was Henry Percy, was sent to appeal to Henry VII on behalf of the region that the tax shouldn't be paid. Henry refused, and Percy was sent back empty-handed. He was then murdered, and the rebels were then led. The leadership was taken up by Egremont, an illegitimate member of the family. So Henry VII dispatched a force under the leadership of the Earl of Surrey, Thomas Howard. This is an interesting move because the Howards had fought against him at Bosworth. This is the first part of the rehabilitation of an important family. As Howard approached, Egremont fled before actual confrontation, and he fled to Burgundy. Again, we've got a similarity here, right, between our previous rebellion, and the importance of Burgundy against Henry VII is clear here. So although the revolt was put down successfully and quickly, the tax did go uncollected. Now the significance of this revolt is that it shows us the importance of regionalism in the early years of the Tudor dynasty. It shows us the limit of the crown's power, that Henry was unable to collect the tax. We have a further indication of Burgundy as a base for Yorkist opposition. And this is the first sign of the rehabilitation of the Howards. After the revolt, the Earl of Surrey, Thomas Howard, is given the position of the Lieutenant of the North. So let's move forward to the other end of the country and look at the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. Again, this is primarily around an issue of taxation. So again, it's the commons who are involved here. But in the aftermath of this rebellion, the pretender to the throne, Perkin Warbeck, also intervenes opportunistically to try to take advantage of the disorder. So here's what happens. Henry VII was again looking to raise funds for military intervention, this time against Scotland. Obviously, the other end of the country to any concerns that the people of Cornwall had. So a local force was raised and it headed east towards London. Now they went via Kent, hoping to raise support from the commoners of Kent, but they were rejected. They ended up facing a royal force at Blackheath, on the outskirts of London. And in the aftermath of this battle, after Henry VII roundly defeats them, Perkin Warbeck landed. This is going to mark the end of his involvement, by the way. So the royal force was victorious at Blackheath. Henry VII was present. This is important because, again, it marks him physically imposing himself over the country. The leaders were executed, and then harsh financial penalties were placed on the region, bringing it squarely under control. So, the significance of this rebellion is, again, it shows us regionalism, firstly the concerns of the Cornish, and then also the way that they were rejected by the people of Kent, who didn't see this dispute as their concern. Again, we see Henry VII acting successfully and decisively. And this also marks the end of the threat of Perkin Warbeck. Now, his intervention had been launched from Scotland, hence the importance of Scotland to the Tudor monarchs. But after he lands, he's defeated at Exeter. He's taken then eventually into prison, and that marks the end of him as a threat. And that had been going on for a number of years. So let's look at two rebellions in the reign of Henry VIII. We're going to look at the Amicable Grant and the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, Henry VIII's reign we can categorise into various periods with one or two themes running through. We should note firstly that his accession to the throne is entirely different. He's unopposed. He doesn't take it by force. He's clearly a legitimate ruler, and this gives him a much easier start to his reign than his father. Now, his reign is marked by a willingness to engage in foreign policy and hence war, and this has impact on domestic situations, and also leads to problems at home, as we'll see. And it's in Henry's reign that religion starts to become important politically. So we're going to see foreign affairs being important at the start and the end of his reign. And while domestic affairs are important in the 1530s, these still have a foreign influence to them. Okay, so let's look at the Amicable Grant of 1525. Now, I'm calling this a rebellion, even though it really doesn't get very far. This is just useful for us to chart in terms of some of the themes which are running through the 1520s, which is, of course, Wolsey's decade. The aim is to prevent the collection of a new tax. Now, opposition to this tax happened across the country, but we're going to particularly focus on events in East Anglia, where opposition was keenest. And I'm also just going to note that although this wasn't organised by Wolsey's opponents at court, they certainly seized on what was happening for their own political advantage. So, in 1525, Henry was looking to capitalise on French weakness after the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Pavia. So he was looking to intervene and raise funds for an intervention. The money that he'd been left by Henry VII had all gone by this stage, and so he needed money. So to try to finance intervention, Wolsey tried to introduce a forced loan, but crucially he did this without going through Parliament. Now, this was not accepted practice. This is not conventional. That was Parliament's kind of main function, was to approve of financial exactions. There was also no promise to return the money. A grant is a gift. So across the country, opposition to this grant, to this loan, took place quite quickly. There was open refusal in East Anglia. So this caused a swift reversal of policy. The Dukes of Suffolk and Norfolk, so that's Brandon and Howard, were dispatched with forces to quell the unrest, and the collection of the tax was quickly abandoned. Now this episode shows us a few things. It shows us the astronomical expense of an active foreign policy. It also shows us how limited Henry's finances were compared to his contemporaries on the continent. He found it impossible to engage on equal terms with Francis I and Charles V. It also indicates the limitation of the Crown's power and the importance of Parliament here, and the way that legitimate government was important as a concept. Now, Wolsey had been desperate to avoid using Parliament because he'd had a chastening experience with Parliament a few years before. He didn't want to expose himself to criticism. Now, this episode weakens Wolsey, but he does politically survive. This is his first major setback while he's in the prime of his power, but it doesn't cause his downfall or seriously threaten him in the way that his failure of the Great Matter did 4 or 5 years later. So if we then fast forward to the Pilgrimage of Grace in the 1530s, where this time we have Henry and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell and their policies being opposed. This is primarily a religious rebellion, but there are social factors involved here too. Now we see again the lower orders being involved here. Now the lower orders were particularly concerned about Cromwell's religious policies. Firstly, for spiritual reasons, but also there are social and economic concerns there because of the extensive charity work that that many communities in the north relied on to get by. However, there's also an element here of of Cromwell's opponents at court using events in the north to their own advantage, particularly the local regional powers such as Lords Darcy and Lord Hussey. So the Pilgrimage of Grace started in a climate of concern and worry. Cromwell had been made vicegerent in spirituals, and he was starting to impose himself over the newly nationalised church. The dissolution of the smaller monasteries had begun. Church property had been audited. Doctrinal changes of belief and practice had started, and this was combined with tax collection of the subsidy, which is the major tax of the period. So if you put all of those together, there's a situation ripe for rebellion. And in Lincolnshire, a local tax collector was killed. A small rebellion starts, but news of this spread across the north, and then spontaneously across the region. Hosts gathered, and commoners joined a rebellion, often demanding leadership by the local gentry. They seized the regional capital of York. That's something which we're going to see happening time and again in our rebellions, and then seized the regional fortress of Pontefract Castle. So quickly, the entire region is out of the control of the crown. Henry sends the Duke of Norfolk to negotiate. Thomas Howard is a good choice. He compares favourably to Cromwell. Cromwell was seen as an upstart, somebody from the lower orders. Howard has Plantagenet heritage, is a leader of the conservative faction at court, and is respected in the north. In his negotiations, Howard, working with Henry's approval, offers a truce to the leader of the pilgrimage, Robert Aske, who is given safe passage down to London. He then stays at court, he Christmases with Henry, and a deal is struck where there was an agreement that a parliament would be held in the north, and that any change in terms of church policy would be paused until that parliament took place. However, Aske had a hard time selling that deal to the other rebels. They didn't all want to accept this. So while the movement fractured and some of the pilgrims returned home, in the north west, Sir Francis Bigod, again a mid-ranking noble, rejected the deal, launched a rebellion, and this gave the crown the excuse that it needed to execute the leaders of the pilgrimage in their hundreds. Now, the significance of the Pilgrimage of Grace is that it shows us the importance of religion in the localities and the role of the local clergy. It shows us how unpopular policies were held at the hands of Henry's chief ministers. Cromwell was a hated figure, just as Wolsey had been before him. It's those individuals that take the blame for policy rather than the monarch. We see further use of the Duke of Norfolk, as we'd seen before. And we also see here actually a long-term gain for the crown. This is the moment of mass opposition to the Reformation and the changes of the 1530s. After the Pilgrimage of Grace, there's no major opposition against, for example, the dissolution of the larger monasteries. So this is the moment where rebellion and opposition to the Reformation is successfully countered in the end. So let's have a look at two rebellions under Edward VI. We're going to look at the Western Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. Now, both of these rebellions happen in 1549. Now, they take place at the end of the protectorship of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. It's Somerset who has control over the council and the regency at this stage, so we need to consider him rather than Edward VI. Now, the regime had inherited problems from the end of Henry VIII's reign. There were economic problems, there was inflation, partly caused by debasement, there were shortages, and Seymour had chosen to continue wars against France. His council was dominated by reformers, but his approach to government was high-handed. This means that he's inextricably and personally linked to policy. These councillors felt distant from decisions that he made. So when things go wrong, he's ultimately accountable personally. So let's look firstly at the Western Rebellion, also the Prayer Book Rebellion. This is an attempt to prevent Protestant changes to religion. It's a rebellion that comes from the lower orders, with also involvement from local clergy and gentry. Its short-term cause is the imposition of Thomas Cranmer's first prayer book, which had affected the way that church services were to be conducted, and it was along reformed lines. Now, these changes hadn't been introduced successfully, and so rebels drew up articles, so their list of complaints, their list of demands, and these contain both religious and social concerns and demands. Now, Seymour dispatched Lord Russell, who was a councillor, who was of local importance. Again, there's a similarity there, right? We've seen that in previous rebellions, that it's the noble who has a local standing or following who is sent to deal and to quell the area. But Russell's force was actually insufficient. Russell found it hard to defeat the rebels. He eventually only defeats them at the second or third time of asking, and therefore this makes the regime, and particularly Seymour himself, look weak. However, when order was restored, again we see the rebel leadership executed, and we see no compromise over policy. So our significance here is we can see the importance of religion in the localities, and the way that religious change had to be carefully managed. We see the limitations of the Duke of Somerset as a leader and the weakness of his position. And we can see that the Edwardian Reformation had been poorly managed, that the introduction of key changes had been clumsy and unsuccessful in the localities. But again, we see the use of a noble with local influence being used to put down the rebellion. So weeks later, in the other side of the country in East Anglia, Kett's rebellion attempted to reverse enclosure, but also had a religious twist to it, but this time looking to promote a reformed religion. Again, commoners are involved here. This is primarily an economic revolt, but they're also led by a local landowner. So again, we have the importance of the gentry, of local gentry in rebellion. It's Robert Kett who gives his name to this rebellion. So since 1548, Seymour had launched enclosure commissions Now he's not the first. He's not the first leader to do so. Wolsey had introduced enclosure commissions in the 1520s. These were attempts to limit enclosure, which had been blamed for many of the economic problems of regions. But this had given the commoners hope. This had led them to believe that their demands, their concerns would be listened to. After riots took place, Kett emerged as their leader. They gathered under arms and they took Norwich, which is again the regional centre. Now we're going to see a familiar story here. The Earl of Arundel, councillor of local importance in East Anglia, is dispatched, but his force was defeated. It was only when another force under the leadership of John Dudley, again a key councillor with military experience, that the rebels were defeated. Now this rebellion has significance for us. Again, it shows us the importance of religion, the importance of reformed religion on the other side of the country. It shows us the importance of the growing economic distress for the lower orders. It shows us that Somerset had mishandled enclosure, as he had previously mishandled religion. And it shows us the limitations of his position, the way that his high-handed personal rule by decree was ultimately a weak position to be in when problems came. Because only weeks and then months later, Arundel and Dudley moved against him, and he is replaced. So finally, let's look at a rebellion under Mary I. Let's look at Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. Now Mary's reign had started with a disputed succession. She'd had to wrestle power away from Jane Grey after John Dudley and Edward VI's attempt to divert the succession. Her early years are taken with the return to Catholicism, which wasn't a straightforward process over the issue of monastic land. And her marriage becomes important. In the early months, it becomes clear that she's going to marry into the Spanish Habsburg royal family. And we can also note in her reign the importance of the council compared to the household. Now, her household, of course, is mostly female, and political decisions are made at council. That becomes the key executive body. So let's look at Wyatt's rebellion. The aim of this rebellion was to prevent the Spanish marriage. This is also tied to religion, inextricably. So it's led by Thomas Wyatt, who's a Protestant courtier. There are a number of other courtiers involved. We can also note the involvement of Edward Courtenay, who had previously been one of Mary's suitors, and there's also support from a foreign power here. There's also support from France. Why are they involved? Well, they're just involved because, of course, they counter the Habsburgs. It's in their interest to destabilise the Habsburg monarchy. So, in this rebellion, the plotters planned synchronised uprising across their localities. They didn't all manage to do so. Again, this shows us how difficult it is to coordinate a rebellion nationally at different places in this period. Edward Courtenay was imprisoned. He was placed in the Tower, as was Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is placed in the Tower to secure her primarily. This is a rebellion about regime change, and she's the obvious alternative, so she needed to be secured. She was later released after questioning. And in this rebellion, Wyatt raised a force. This then defeated a royal force led by the ageing Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, again sent out to try to restore order. It then advanced to London. Now he came close. He made it all the way to Ludgate, and after a rallying speech by Mary at the Guildhall, the gates held. Wyatt is surrounded, and then he's arrested. But Wyatt and the leading conspirators were again then executed. So we've got common themes coming here again. So we can see our usual areas here, but we've got some things of note. I think we can see here the importance of personal advancement to courtiers, the way that they can be inspired by their own political agendas. Wyatt and the others have been worried about the introduction of Spaniards at court, the way that this would limit their own potential for advancement and positions. The growing importance of national liberty. And the importance of gender politics here, that this is particularly a reaction to a foreign king incoming. Compare that, for example, to the way that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Spanish royal family, had been a popular move. So here are our rebellions. What I'd like you to do here is to pause the presentation, take each one and see if you can see, looking across the timeline, any rebellions that have similarities or profound differences. Where can you see common themes in either the aims of the rebels or the outcomes or what their major concerns were? Just see if you can find similarity and just note those down. So here are a couple of practice questions for you to have a go at. These aren't from past papers, these are just mocked. So you can either go, firstly, the causes of rebellion against Henry VIII were primarily the same as those of rebellions against Henry VII. How far do you agree? Or you could go for assess the reasons why rebellions took place against the rule of Henry VII.